Good evening. It's November 10th, 2025. I've been doing this long enough to know when something doesn't add up, and tonight, something truly doesn't. All over Washington, headlines are screaming that the shutdown is over, that the crisis has been averted, that the government is back to work. But behind that polished announcement, behind the smiling press conferences and the carefully worded statements, there's a deeper truth, and it's one that you're not supposed to see. Because what just happened isn't a victory for the American people. It's the opposite. It's a cover-up, dressed as progress. When I first heard that Chuck Schumer's $90 billion plan had collapsed, my instinct wasn't to celebrate. It was to ask the obvious question, why now? Why, after weeks of stalemate and political theater, did this so-called breakthrough suddenly appear out of nowhere? You see, in Washington, nothing ever just happens. Every move is calculated, every message scripted, every headline tested before it reaches you. And when all sides, Republicans, Democrats, even the corporate press, start repeating the same line in unison, you can bet the truth is hiding in the silence between their words. For weeks, millions of Americans sat at home, watching politicians argue about a shutdown that they themselves created. You were told that government workers weren't getting paid, that essential services were frozen, that chaos was looming. But no one bothered to explain why this shutdown started in the first place. Because if they had, you might have realized it was never about budgeting or fairness. It was about leverage, the oldest currency in Washington. The shutdown became a weapon, a way to break public resistance and reshape policy while the cameras focused on the spectacle. Now, let's talk about this $90 billion plan. Schumer's proposal was sold as an economic rescue package, something to stabilize federal operations and prevent long-term damage. But if you actually dig into the numbers, and few people ever do, you'll find that only a fraction of that money was truly destined for relief. The rest was buried under layers of special interests, quiet earmarks, and conveniently vague language. It wasn't a plan to reopen the country. It was a plan to redirect billions, quietly and permanently, under the pretense of a crisis. And now that the plan has collapsed, the same architects are already rewriting it behind closed doors. The political establishment wants you to believe that Trump ended the shutdown. That he forced Washington's hand, that he stood his ground and walked away victorious. But what if that's only half true? What if, instead of a clean win, this was the moment he chose to expose just how deep the rot goes, to force Schumer, Pelosi, and every career bureaucrat into the light? Because for all the noise and outrage, one thing is undeniable: Trump's decision changed the script. The negotiations weren't supposed to end this way. The media expected him to fold under pressure, to take the blame, to retreat quietly into political isolation. But instead, he flipped the table, and for the first time in months, Washington was speechless. I've seen that look before, the panic that flashes across the faces of people who just lost control of a narrative they thought they owned. You could feel it in the tone of the morning shows, the hesitant phrasing of the anchors, the sudden switch from triumph to confusion. They didn't know how to spin it, because Trump didn't play by their rules. He didn't negotiate for optics. He pulled the plug on the very mechanism they were using to manipulate the crisis. And when he did, the $90 billion illusion came crashing down like a house of cards. But let's not romanticize this moment. Ending the shutdown doesn't mean the system is fixed. It doesn't mean accountability has returned. It just means the illusion couldn't hold any longer. What we're watching right now isn't reform, it's rearrangement. The same power brokers who created the crisis are already shaping the next one. And while the public breathes a sigh of relief, believing the danger has passed, the machinery of corruption keeps humming quietly in the background, preparing its next act. Think about it. In every so-called emergency of the past decade, whether economic, social, or political, the outcome has always been the same. The people lose power, the government gains control, and the truth is buried under layers of justification. The pattern never changes. Because crisis isn't a failure of the system, it's the system itself. It's how they govern now. manufacturing urgency, forcing decisions before anyone can question the details, and framing every dissenting voice as dangerous or divisive. So yes, maybe the shutdown is technically over. But don't mistake silence for peace. Don't mistake headlines for truth. The real battle has just shifted to a quieter front, the one where public attention fades and policy is written in the shadows. Tonight, as you sit there watching this unfold, remember that transparency doesn't come from press conferences. It comes from asking the questions they refuse to answer. Because the truth about this so-called victory, this $90 billion scheme that just collapsed, is that it was never meant to serve you. It was meant to distract you. To make you believe that dysfunction is normal, that chaos is progress, that surrender is leadership. And if that sounds cynical, good. Because cynicism is just another word for awareness in a time when trust has become a luxury. The shutdown might have ended on paper, but the corruption that fueled it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there, smiling behind the podiums, drafting the next bipartisan deal, and waiting for the next distraction. When I look back at what unfolded over these past few days, it's not the press conferences or the staged applause that stay with me. It's the silence, the quiet between the announcements, the brief moments where even seasoned politicians seemed unsure of their own performance. Because in that silence, you can see how the system really works. You can see who actually holds the levers. The shutdown wasn't just a fight about money or party lines, it was a power exercise, a controlled experiment to remind everyone, including you, who decides when the country stops and when it moves again. You see, Washington thrives on crisis. The political class needs it the way a gambler needs the rush of the next bet. Without chaos, they lose relevance. Without a problem to solve, they can't justify their authority. So they create one. Then they argue about it in public while the real decisions, the ones that change your life, happen in private. The shutdown was only the latest chapter in that cycle. It was designed to keep Americans anxious, distracted, and divided long enough for the machinery of control to operate without scrutiny. I've talked to people inside that system, staffers, aides, even former bureaucrats, who admit it openly, though never on record. They describe a city where the goal isn't to fix anything, but to maintain perpetual negotiation. It's a game of illusion. You manufacture conflict, you dramatize solutions, and in the end, everyone walks away richer, more connected, more entrenched. That's why Schumer's $90 billion plan wasn't just an accounting document. It was a test balloon, floated to see how far they could go before the public noticed. When it fell apart, it wasn't because of some moral awakening in Congress. It was because the backlash came faster than expected. People were angry, not in a partisan way, but in a primal one, tired of being manipulated. And that's when Trump made his move. Say what you want about him, and trust me, people say plenty, but he understands spectacle better than anyone alive. He knows that timing is everything. By declaring the shutdown over before Washington could spin its next narrative, he seized control of the story. He forced the establishment to react instead of dictate. For a moment, they lost the script, and when they lose the script, their power weakens. Still, don't make the mistake of thinking this was spontaneous. Behind every statement, every tweet, every calculated pause, there's a chessboard of alliances and rivalries that most Americans never see. There are donors who expect returns, agencies that protect their funding streams, lobbyists who write the very bills your representatives pretend to debate. Schumer's collapse wasn't the end of corruption, it was a redistribution of influence. Money never disappears in Washington, it just changes pockets. I've always said that if you want to understand how power functions, follow the emotion, not the legislation. What emotions did this shutdown evoke? Fear, frustration, helplessness. And what happens when people feel powerless? They demand leadership. They crave order. They look to the same institutions that failed them for rescue. That's the paradox. The more chaotic things become, the stronger the establishment grows. The people who create the fire are the same ones selling you the extinguisher. But here's what they didn't expect this time. People are watching differently now. The age of blind trust is over. Americans no longer consume the news as passive observers. They analyze, they share, they question, and that terrifies the elites. Because the greatest threat to their control isn't another politician, it's collective awareness. The internet, despite all its flaws, has given ordinary citizens access to data that used to be locked away in private briefings. And that access changes everything. Of course, they're trying to adapt. You'll notice a growing movement to regulate misinformation, to ensure safety, to protect democracy. Those phrases sound noble, but they're masks. What they really mean is, control the flow of narrative before it undermines authority. Because if people truly understood how decisions are made, they might start asking why they need so many middlemen between themselves and the truth. This entire shutdown drama, from the budget impasse to the supposed resolution, was a message to anyone who still believes in accountability. The message is simple: power doesn't yield voluntarily. It doesn't apologize or step aside. It simply changes language, changes spokespersons, and continues. Trump's maneuver disrupted that rhythm, yes, but it didn't destroy it. For a few days, he exposed how shallow the structure has become, how desperate the media is to preserve its monopoly on narrative. And that exposure hurt them more than any bill or speech ever could. I've often said that politics today isn't about ideology, it's about psychology. The side that controls perception controls reality. When you convince people that government dysfunction is just part of life, something unavoidable, like bad weather, they stop demanding better. They stop believing change is possible. And once that happens, democracy becomes theater, nothing more. But something feels different this time. Maybe it's exhaustion, maybe it's awakening. Maybe, after years of noise, Americans are beginning to see the pattern for what it is: a distraction, an elaborate puppet show designed to keep us arguing about symptoms while the disease spreads quietly in the background. You can feel it in conversations, in independent media, in the growing refusal to buy into the binary narratives. It's subtle, but it's there, a hum of skepticism that's starting to drown out the propaganda machine. And that's what terrifies Washington most. Not one man, not one election, but the idea that people might stop believing the illusion altogether. That's why every headline now feels like crisis. That's why every disagreement is framed as apocalypse. Because if people ever stopped fearing the chaos would lose its power. This is where the real story lies, not in the $90 billion that vanished into bureaucracy, not in the talking points rehearsed on late-night TV, but in the slow unraveling of trust. When institutions can no longer command belief, they turn to control. And when control becomes obvious, rebellion becomes inevitable. That's not prophecy, it's human nature. You can sense it, can't you? That quiet tension that hangs in the air when something enormous is about to shift. It's not loud or theatrical, it's subtle, the stillness before a storm. Washington wants you to believe that things have returned to normal, that the shutdown is history, that the machine is back on track. But normal is a myth. It's the story they sell to make you stop paying attention. Because what we just witnessed wasn't an isolated political episode, it was a revelation of how fragile the entire system has become. When I talk to ordinary Americans, the feeling I hear most isn't anger anymore, it's disbelief. Disbelief that people who swore to serve the public could so openly manipulate a national crisis for personal gain. Disbelief that $90 billion could simply evaporate into the labyrinth of bureaucracy without accountability. Disbelief that the same figures who created the shutdown now walk away from it declaring themselves heroes. It's as if the nation has been watching a play for years, only to suddenly realize that the actors forgot the script and the curtain never closes. I've seen Washington from the inside long enough to know that the most dangerous lies are the ones told politely. Not the outrageous fabrications, but the gentle assurances: it's under control, the experts have it handled, this is for your benefit. Those lines are repeated like prayers, empty, mechanical, but comforting enough to silence doubt. That's how control survives. It doesn't need force when it has faith. But faith, once broken, doesn't return easily. And right now, millions of Americans are beginning to question not just the politicians, but the structure itself. Trump's decision to end the shutdown, or rather, to expose its artificial nature, didn't just disrupt a political cycle. It cracked open the illusion of inevitability. It showed that one man refusing to play by their rules could throw an entire establishment into disarray. And that's precisely why they fear him, not because of what he says, but because he reminds people that the system isn't divine, that it can be interrupted, challenged, and even dismantled. That realization is contagious. Once people see power exposed as human, fallible, self-interested, corruptible, they stop worshiping it. The truth is, this was never about money. It was about control, the currency that never loses value in Washington. That's why the $90 billion scheme mattered so much. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a signal of how far they're willing to go to maintain leverage over every aspect of your life. Budgets, policies, emergencies, they're all instruments in a symphony of compliance. The goal isn't to solve the crisis, it's to make sure there's always another one waiting in the wings. But something broke this time. You can feel it in the unease of the media, in the sudden shift of tone from confidence to defensiveness. The usual rhythm of outrage and resolution faltered. The public didn't return to obedience. Instead, they began asking questions, and in an age of information, questions are more dangerous than rebellion. Because questions spread. They travel across social networks, across dinner tables, across the country, infecting every conversation with curiosity. And curiosity is the one thing the establishment can't control. We've reached a point where pretending is no longer sustainable. The old narratives of benevolent leaders, of responsible governance, of trustworthy institutions have worn thin. What's emerging in their place isn't cynicism, it's clarity. A recognition that power has always depended on consent, and consent can be withdrawn. When you stop believing their version of reality, their version collapses. That's what we're witnessing right now, a collapse not of government, but of illusion. Still, this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a much harder chapter. Because awareness without action is paralysis. Knowing the truth means nothing if people still choose comfort over courage. The next test won't come from another shutdown or another scheme. It will come from how the public responds to the next narrative they try to sell. Will people question it, or will they surrender, grateful for the familiar reassurance that everything is fine? You and I both know the answer depends on us. On whether we choose to stay silent or speak, to observe or engage. Because democracy isn't something you inherit, it's something you maintain, word by word, act by act. The system doesn't fear politicians, it fears citizens who think critically. That's why, even as this moment fades from headlines, it must not fade from memory. As for me, I'll keep talking, keep asking, keep refusing to repeat their script. Because truth, no matter how inconvenient, is still the most patriotic act left to perform. And if that makes me unpopular in certain circles, so be it. The price of silence is far higher than the cost of dissent. So if you've made it this far, if you're still watching, still questioning, that means you're part of something bigger than outrage. You're part of awareness. And awareness is where every real change begins. Don't let them tell you this is over. The story isn't finished, not by a long shot. If you believe in uncovering what's real, if you refuse to let scripted news dictate your perception of the world, then make sure you stay connected. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments, because that's how truth survives. Through conversation. Through community. Through the courage to see what's in front of us, and still keep looking deeper. Because in a world built on illusion, the simple act of paying attention is revolutionary.